In this video, I'll be talking about the PowerMac G4 Cube. It was announced July 19th, 2000, discontinued July 3rd, 2001. It has a PowerPC G4 7400 processor running at 450 MHz. It came with 64 megabytes of RAM installed. The problem with doing a video on the G4 Cube is that it's such a unique and iconic Mac that it's been well covered on YouTube by other collectors. So it's hard to come up with anything you couldn't already see elsewhere. Wait, what? No, I'm still doing a video. I'll start with my experience with the Cube. In February 2000, I bought a 400 MHz sawtooth G4. July 2000 came along and Apple announces a second generation of G4 towers called the Gigabit Ethernet models. Even though it was more significant that the mid-range and high-end models had dual processors.
And we're doing it all for the same price.
Yeah, except they took away the standard zip drive on those two models, but whatever.
On every PowerMac model, we are also adding Gigabit Ethernet on the motherboard.
Yeah, well, I could not care less about Gigabit Ethernet. The top speed 56K modem was all I needed.
Just as you would at the end of a normal phone conversation, you need to hang up the line when you are finished using the internet.
Yeah, I know, I keep forgetting that. The only other significant difference between mine and the new 400 MHz was the hard drive was doubled in size to 20 gigabytes. Well, yeah, that would have been nice. Oh, and Apple admitted that the keyboard and mouse that shipped with my G4 were crappy.
Some people think that this is the worst mouse in the world. We'd like to change that. We're going to go from what some people feel is maybe the worst mouse in the industry to the best. Yay.
Damn!
Isn't that great?
Apple introduced the Pro Mouse with an optical motion sensor instead of the standard mechanical ball design. This was cool new tech at the time. Plus, the entire front end pivoted to function as the button. Also introduced, the new full-size Pro keyboard. The keyboard and mouse were designed around the G4's clear plastic theme, color neutral and included with all towers and iMacs. But one negative about the new G4s, the 16 megabyte ATI video card no longer had the digital monitor port called DVI. It was replaced with a modified version of DVI called Apple Display Connector, or ADC. It was a proprietary Apple port used to connect and supply power to their new line of monitors. Oh, wait a minute.
Our philosophy on I/O ports has three key components to it. The first is use industry standards. When we go to device manufacturers, we don't want to say, do something special in the hardware for Apple.
Yeah, what happened to that? Hey, I was fine with my VGA 17-inch CRT monitor. Where are the feet? Are the feet on? Thanks to ADC supplying power through the monitor cable, the monitor plug-in on the power supply would soon disappear, never to return, even after ADC failed. Overall, I'm glad I bought when I did. An interesting side note, just before the July 2000 Macworld, an announcement from ATI was published that their new video card, called the Radeon, with 32 megabytes VRAM, would be demoed on the PowerMac G4 Tower at the keynote. But when Steve Jobs found out about the pre-announcement, he dropped the Radeon demo. In fact, he made sure not to mention any of ATI's products during the keynote. Radeon, like that name was going to catch on anyway. But at the end of the July 2000 Macworld product introductions...
But there's one more thing. The PowerMac G4 Cube, or more affectionately, the G4 Cube. And I would like to show it to you now. Let's bring it out.
It is pretty much fact that the influence for the G4 Cube was Steve Jobs' Next Cube.
How did we decide on the cube design? It turns out after examining several, it is by far the most efficient in terms of packaging stuff in here. As we said earlier, we've got one board in here. We have room for 3 additional boards. We can even plug 3 of our processor boards in here, in addition to the one that's in there. We can fit up to 1.3 gigabytes in here, and up to 3 next year. So what you can fit in a 1-foot cube, which is smaller footprint than a PC even, is quite remarkable. Thank you very much for coming today. We really appreciate it a lot.
And so it was Steve's first attempt at a cube computer. This was 1988, I don't know if I mentioned that. I'm fortunate enough to have one of these in my collection, so you can see the 2 cubes side by side. Oh wait, no, it's fake. The G4 Cube took the G4 Tower's aesthetic, shrank it, and reshaped it into a computer 1/4 the size of the tower. That was part of the attraction for me because I already thought the G4 Tower looked really cool. August 2000, the Cube was released to stores. Apple created this interactive in-store demo to run on the display units, so they wouldn't need to rely on Windows leading salespeople. Pretty effective demo. It let you look at a lot of information. If you have a Cube running OS 9, you can run this demo on your machine. You'll find it available for download on sites like Macintosh Garden or Macintosh Repository. The Cube had the usual spike of buyers upon release, but sales fell off unusually fast. Quickly, Apple offered rebates. In Canada, the Fair and Square deal, $450 back if you bought an Apple monitor and the Cube. In the US, it was a $300 rebate. It was a deal similar to the one offered at our local oil museum in 1998. I don't know if this is where Apple got the idea.
You see those water bottles? They were not, we changed this whole store around because nothing was selling, but those water bottles especially were not selling. She was trying to sell them for like $5 and they weren't selling, so she had them marked down to like $1, which was a humongous loss because we paid like $5 for them. So we made a deal. You buy a water bottle for $3, you get a free pop, and so many people come in and are just going to buy an 80-cent pop, and we say, if you buy that water bottle, you get the pop free. Really? And they buy the water bottle for $3.
However, the rebates had little to no effect. At year-end 2000, Apple reported October to December Cube sales were a dismal 29,000 units. $90 million below Apple's expectations on this new model. January 2001, and the 3rd generation of G4 Towers are launched, called the Digital Audio G4s.
Today, we're launching a whole new generation of Power Mac G4s. So 4 models, 466 megahertz up to 733.
Making the 450 megahertz Cube look even worse. Just like Spock conspicuously missing from this box of cornflakes, any mention of the Cube was conspicuously missing during this keynote. Not a good sign. And with ATI in the doghouse, Apple had cozied up to NVIDIA, and now the 32 megabyte GeForce 2MX video card, not Radeon, was standard on all but the low-end tower. On the Cube, you could get a GeForce 2MX or Radeon as build-to-order options. In Tokyo, February 22, 2001, Apple announced a deal with NVIDIA, and GeForce 3 with 64 megabytes VRAM became an Apple exclusive.
We're going to offer the GeForce 3 on the Power Mac G4 line as a build-to-order option from customers or resellers, so it's available across the line. We're going to ship it in late March at a cost of $600.
Holy crap. As for the Cube, February 22nd also saw Apple knock $500 off the price, now $12.99, and introduced 2 new standard configurations with more RAM, CD burners, and the GeForce 2MX card in the high end. All still 450 MHz. Even though 500 MHz was always available as a build-to-order option, it never made it into a standard configuration. Please note that I am showing 3 cubes here by digital special effect. Nobody has 3 G4 cubes. While the original cube was introduced with macOS 9.04, 2001 cubes came with macOS 9.1. 9.1 had been released that January with absolutely no fanfare. The fanfare was being saved for the new macOS 10, released March 24th, 2001. Enough with that. What was the result of the price drop and new configurations? Cube sales from January to March 2001 were 12,000 units. Apple planned to have sold 500,000 units by this point, but ultimately halted production in July 2001 after 150,000 total units had been produced. Apple shareholders celebrated the cancellation of the Cube. But for those that bought a Cube, they realized it was fairly upgradable, despite touting its fanless design and silent operation.
Virtual silence.
Apple had secretly engineered the Cube to be able to accept a slim 80mm fan inside, which led to third-party processor upgrades up to a 1.8 GHz G4.
Professional installation highly recommended.
Likewise, better video cards could be put in, the easiest being the GeForce 3, having the requisite small size and identical port layout to the original Rage 128 card. But unfortunately this card is quite rare, which makes me conclude the GeForce 3 did not make as big a splash as Apple hoped. Of course, many cards were not going to fit, limiting graphics card options. However, the RAM, processor, and video upgrades actually allowed the Cube to outperform the early Mac Minis from 2005. So what went wrong? When Steve introed the Cube, I was briefly struck with buyer's remorse. It looks really cool, the same specs as the Tower, except it can only hold 1 hard drive, the same video card, no PCI slots.
$17.99.
Yeah, never mind. In the late 90s, the goal was to simplify the product line, and the 1998 lineup was the most simple Apple had had since the 80s. In desktops, you have the all-in-one, albeit just for education, the G3 desktop and the G3 Tower, which had been each fairly well siloed into separate price ranges. But by summer 2000, they have the all-in-one iMacs from $7.99 to $14.99, and a Tower line ranging from $15.99 to $34.99, leaving little room for a desktop model, let alone pricing it at $17.99. Ultimately, it was buried by the low-end G4 Tower. Getting hypothetical, I think the only way the Cube could have been successful would be to have it replace the low-end Tower at the same $15.99 price, forcing customers to compromise on expandability. But I can't imagine Apple doing that. Yeah. But the low-end Tower was by far the top seller, so I doubt they'd want to mess with that. Apple was having an equally hard time moving the dual-processor G4s, and threw in steep rebates on those as well. Hiding behind the apparent simplicity of Steve's 4-quadrant product strategy, Apple had actually reverted the product lines back to near Spindler levels of complexity.
Want to refresh your course, the $7.99 model only comes in Indigo. The $9.99 model comes in Indigo and Ruby. The $12.99 model comes in Indigo, Ruby, and Sage. And iMac DV Special Edition comes in Graphite and Snow.
You're confusing me.
Now they were adding another category.
But today, the first time in 2.5 years, we are expanding our product strategy. And it's not a portable. It is a new desktop machine. What is it?
It's the Cube. At this point, Steve had so much power within Apple that he could put forth the idea of an attention-grabbing neck-style Cube computer, and no one at Apple would question him on it. And of course, no one outside of Apple even knew what they were planning. though rumor sites had determined it was going to be a cube of some sort. Yeah, not quite, guys. And consider this. If you were to pick a Mac most similar to the Cube, it would arguably be the 20th anniversary Macintosh from 1997. Both were wildly original designs, with Johnny Ive as the lead designer on the projects. Both were expensively priced, yet weak on specs, had a vertically mounted optical drive, external power supply, high-end name-brand speakers, Bose and Harman Kardon, yet both lacked mass market appeal and were discontinued after a year. Keeping that in mind, the 20th anniversary Macintosh was introduced at the January 1997 Macworld. The two founding Steves were brought on stage by CEO Gil Amelio for the reveal.
We're going to give two of these to the two Steves, and all we have to do is sort out who gets which serial number. And the tradition on that, as you may know from the story, is Steve Wozniak got badge number 1, so we're going to give him serial number 1. Steve Jobs took serial number 0. So he's got that.
Steve can't believe his good fortune. Later, Steve was heard to say that the 20th anniversary Macintosh represented everything that was wrong with Apple when he returned. So, 3.5 years later, he unveils effectively the same thing? Understanding how the 20th anniversary Macintosh failed should have told them that passion projects like the Cube were not going to be successful. It went to show Steve's strong bias against Amelio's Apple clouding his business sense. He was so convinced everything Apple was doing in the 90s was wrong that he was ignoring the lessons learned during that time. Recently, current CEO Tim Cook discussed the Cube during a Q&A session at the Oxford Foundry.
We shipped a product called the Cube. Some of you may remember it if you followed Apple a lot. It was a very important product to us. We put a lot of love into it. We put enormous engineering into it. It was an engineering marvel. It was a spectacular failure commercially. I mean, from the first day almost. Something that you were so passionate about, and this was another thing Steve taught me actually, that you're so passionate about, you've sold it to everybody, you've got to be willing to look yourself in the mirror and say, I was wrong. It's not right.
Well, it should have never got past the design stage in the first place. But luckily for us collectors, it did, and it is beautiful. When the Cube was introduced, Apple ads boasted it belonged in the Museum of Modern Art. Ironically, after it was discontinued, it was inducted into the museum along with its peripherals. Whether the Cube was a success or fail, at least Apple was drawing massive attention to itself. Today, with Apple no longer in the business of taking design risks, it's unlikely we'll see anything like the Cube again. It seems like Apple can't innovate anymore on computer design. Wait, a new Mac Mini? Let's see.
Timpani.
Can't innovate anymore, my ass.
The Cube was criticized by many as Apple choosing form over function. You see this all the time with, say, furniture. More like a decoration than a tool for doing work. Others felt that such a compact design could not cool itself effectively without a fan. Some complaints were definitely true. Apple sacrificed a lot of practical usability just to keep the sides blank and featureless, except the graphite Apple logo. If you look closely at the back, you'll see model information in tiny white print, a legal requirement, and you'll see these ceramic discs trying to blend in. Those have the Wi-Fi antennas behind them and allow the signals to pass through the case. The Cube never came with an airport wireless card, but you could add one yourself. The biggest problem with this minimalist design decision and hiding all the I/O ports on the bottom made them much less accessible and not very practical for active use. And while promotional materials avoided showing it, this was the reality of the situation. The gap in the back brought cables out and also brought air in to feed the Cube's convection cooling. ADC helped reduce cables, allowing the keyboard, mouse, and speakers to plug into the back of the monitor. But the monitor itself, power, firewire, and any wired network cables had to make a connection in the bottom of the cube. The reset and interrupt buttons are here too, which was slightly inconvenient for users needing on-the-fly access to them.
Damn!
Once you figured out how to find them by touch, you were alright. But trying to plug something in is another matter. Oh, and note that the underside of the cube has exactly the same aluminum vented panel as the future PowerMac G5 tower. You still had the built-in option of the 56K modem and Ethernet. In 2001, Gigabit Ethernet began being offered to the cube as a build-to-order option. Yeah, whatever.
What all these things are talking about is the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web basically lets everyone on the internet, including you by the way, publish text, pictures, and even sound and video to everyone else on the internet.
Yeah, I know that already. The spherical stereo speakers were included because without them, the cube would not have any way to generate sound. These are not the cheap analog speakers that you'll find no shortage of at second-hand stores. These were 20-watt, fully digital Carmen Harden speakers, designed specifically for the cube. The speakers came with these 3-hole grills, which did slightly interfere with sound quality, but gave the speakers a fighting chance against accidental damage or children. And by the way, they were just asking for it with the G4 Quicksilver Tower. The speakers connect by USB, and there's a breakout box on the cable, which is the amplifier, and allowed you to connect headphones. But short of buying a USB microphone, there was no sound input for the cube. That's okay, I got my dictaphone. In this video, I'll be talking about the PowerMac G4 Cube. The cube was specially designed to boost USB power to the speakers, so connecting them to other computers never worked very well. The speakers outlived the cube, being sold as accessories for the 2001 digital audio G4s, and later as optional speakers for the iMac G4. Though the digital audio connector for these is completely different from the USB connector for the cube speakers. Okay, let's start it up. No, not that thing. Enough! First plug it in. Apple sweated every detail as usual. The molded AC power plug was transparent. The same with most of the cable connectors. It's connected to a space-saving external power supply with its own unusual style. A capacitive sensor detects when the power icon is touched. For greater convenience, there was a power button on the new Apple LCD monitors, which would also power on the computer thanks to ADC. Also, you could activate the brightness control panel with another sensor button. Pretty cool use of capacitive sensor technology, and has since exploded with the touchscreens on these handheld computers known as iPhone. Unfortunately, things like interference from nearby devices could start turning the machine on and off randomly. What the hell? Similarly, the tendency to turn it on or off if you accidentally brush the sensor annoyed many users. And it's not a real power button anyway, since pressing again just puts the system into sleep. The only way to fully shut down is in software. In sleep, the LED below the power button pulses. Now, if it is monitoring for an incoming fax, the light would not pulse, even though it's in sleep, because, you know, fax is... Wait, what? No! I actually still have interesting things to say about the cube. I found this cube system for sale online and got it for $175 5 years ago. Probably the most I've ever paid for a collection Mac. But it's in great condition. The cube specs, whether build to order or standard config, will be in the tiniest print on a label on the bottom of the cube. So the one I bought is the later configuration from 2001. Mine had a CD burner instead of the original DVD-ROM. Apple's January 2001 push into music with CD burners also brought new software to control it all, called iTunes. Apple had purchased Casty and Green's excellent SoundJam MP software and used it as the basis for iTunes, simultaneously replacing Apple's long-standing CD player app. They gave iTunes an OS X Aqua skin, even though OS X would not officially be released for a couple months. A very simple layout, and the most incredible thing, being given away free. Today's Macs come with iTunes 12. Oh my god. Unfortunate that mine does not have the DVD drive. These days, being able to watch DVDs is much more useful than ripping and burning CDs. Also, even though mine works so far, the slot-load optical drive is reported as one of the parts most prone to failure on the Cube. All Cubes came with a digital video editing application, iMovie 2, also introduced at the July 2000 Macworld. A huge improvement over iMovie 1, which shipped with the 1999 iMac DV models. I had to pay $49 to get iMovie 2 for my G4 Tower, but it came free with any new Mac that had a FireWire port, and that included the Cube. The computers even had a FireWire cable included because they felt so strongly about their new software. It's hard to put into words how much of an improvement editing digital video on a computer was, as compared with editing on videotape. Don't congratulate me on having camera equipment accurate to the era. That's my current equipment. You controlled the tape drive from your Mac. As you imported digital video to your hard drive, iMovie divided the clips. One thing that I always liked was that iMovie picks the time code from the tape and displays it. So of course they did away with that in future versions. You could add transitions like cross dissolve. I don't remember renders taking this long. Like iTunes, it had an OS X skin. They're a beautiful edit. When OS X was introduced, so were OS X versions of iTunes and iMovie 2. iMovie 3 came along in 2003 as part of the new iLife bundle, and was OS X only. This version was garbage. It was so slow I found it unusable. I personally moved on to Final Cut at that point and never used iMovie again. The 4 CD-ROM discs that this Cube came with were the Install disc, Restore disc, an Applications disc, even though the applications simply consisted of 3 kids games. I'm not sure these were the most appropriate for the Cube. More appropriate for the iMac. Like, what about including adult games like Starship Titanic by the late Douglas Adams? Adams was a huge Macintosh fan, and with typical Adams sense of humor, at the start of the game your PC crashes loading the Starship Titanic game, and then Starship Titanic itself crashes into your PC. Starship Titanic is a fun game if you have the patience for solving puzzles. With an initial Mac release date of 1999...
For heaven's sake, get on with it!
Sorry, Douglas. Yes, and a bootable hardware diagnostic disc, specifically for the G4 Cube, was included. The introductory video that plays on the first boot leading into the Setup Assistant is quite similar to the one you'd see on the Power Mac G4. Future first boot videos would focus on OS X instead of the Mac model. There were 3 new ADC monitors. the giant 22-inch flat panel that was already available for the G4 towers and still $39.99, but now with the new ADC connector. The 15-inch LCD monitor design from 1998 was getting long in the tooth. Its use of translucent, colorful plastic predated even the original iMac. So with the new Cube, they revamped it with the same design as the 22-inch and a price of $999. The $499 17-inch CRT was retained for the sake of low-end consumers. Hey, but this new one was given an acrylic makeover as well and maintained the $499 price. Amazing that even this CRT model was powered by ADC. I mean, I get why ADC was developed. Like, what a mess. ADC was extremely convenient. I think it is even possible that ADC was developed primarily with the Cube in mind. Steve had tried a similar thing on the next Cube.
It connects to the Cube with one 3-meter cable here, and that 3-meter cable supplies it video at 100 megahertz. It also supplies it power. One cable carries video, USB, and power from the computer, so there's only one cable replacing 3.
Apple should have known better. They had the failed high-density monitor port on the first-generation PowerPCs just 5 years earlier. But ADC became more of a burden after Apple abandoned it and returned to DVI in 2004. If you wanted to retain one of these monitors into the late G5, Mac Mini, or Intel era, you need a monstrous ADC to DVI converter. Apple would sell you one for $149, or you can get an off-brand one from Dr. Bott. And keep in mind there was still the analog VGA option available. Apple included a right-angle adapter with the Cube to plug a VGA monitor into, but the video card does not support 2 displays simultaneously. You have to use one port or the other. The 17-inch CRT monitor was probably the toughest piece of molding Apple had ever attempted. I recently got one online. The ad said it was in flawless shape, with a little dust inside. Of course it is not. Sure, there's dust inside, a lot of dust, and spider webs, and there's house paint on it. Dude, the disassembly required just to get the rear bubble off is not easy. I got the stand off, and the next step is to remove 10 screws and use a plastic screwdriver to press release tabs, and this is where I struggled because you can't see what the latches look like. I did finally get the bubble off, and so here they are. They do just press in. Gross. The bubble has a paraboloid shape and clearly influenced the eMac design, introduced a year after this display was discontinued. This monitor has physical buttons instead of the capacitive sensors. But it is a really high-tech monitor. It has theater mode for playing DVDs, up to a 154 Hz refresh rate, built-in color calibration, and completely flat screen to truly eliminate distortion. They even gave it its own startup noise, which I had no idea about. This was way beyond any CRT monitor Apple had produced before, but it would be their last. The clear plastic of the bubble was formulated to filter out RF radiation, eliminating the need for metal panels inside like the previous CRTs, allowing you to have an unobstructed view of the monitor's inner workings. Nonetheless, it sold very poorly, likely because it was ADC and could not be used by us previous Mac owners, or even PC users who might have bought it because they thought it looked cool. The Apple CRT monitor was discontinued May 21st, 2001. The 15-inch LCD dropped in price to $599 to fill the void. The 22-inch dropped to $24.99, and a new 17-inch LCD was introduced at $999. The transparent outer casing of the Cube is made of acrylic plastic, also known by trade names lucite or plexiglass. Don't sit down on your plexiglass toilet, yeah! I'm going to continue calling it acrylic plastic. Another problem is they started getting complaints of cracks in the acrylic case. In actuality, most of these complaints were not cracks. They were from molding the case. Then there were lines that were formed in the surface as a molding defect, but easily mistaken for scratches and usually extending from the optical drive slot and similar ones around the screw holes. Any actual scratches were usually done in the hands of the owner. The downside of the acrylic age of Macs is that they scratch very easily, so you better practice your buffing skills if you want to restore Apple products from this era. But don't get too picky about this stuff. At least you're not this poor guy who bought 2 G4 cubes and had them smashed in transit. The most well-known feature of the cube is how to get into the internals.
And you literally lift all of the technology out.
Apple would often incorporate uniquely engineered parts which you would not normally find on consumer-grade electronics, giving them this unique cool factor. The cube was highly marketed for its incredibly small size, such as its footprint was smaller than a piece of paper. This miniaturization continued long after the cube's demise. The cube's eventual successor, the Mac Mini, will actually fit in the airspace under the cube. Hey, get that out of there. The Mac Mini reintroduced the desktop Mac to the lineup, but this time it was placed at the low end instead of the mid-range, and hence its success. The cube design influenced many products that followed. The Mac Mini has the same rounded corners, no doubt a nod to its predecessor. The Apple TV and Airport wireless router were also based on this aesthetic. The present-day Mac Mini actually matches the 8-inch cube footprint. And we may yet see more nods to the cube in the future. In this video, we'll be talking about the Mac Pro early 2037. A computer that distilled the internet into a spoken interface. What us old folks remember as iTunes was now fully integrated into the OS. Computer, play hits of the 20s.
Who said I was a bum? Who said I was a bum?
What is this? You know I meant hits of the 2020s, not 1920s.
I know I'm a hobo, but who said I was a bum?
Computer, please connect to my Apple extended keyboard.
Are you kidding?
Do it.
This guy must be out. He must be a space case. Man, yeah, he is good.
Apple's greatest successes came from giving people products they didn't know they needed.
Oh my God.
The Cube was not one of those products. The thing is, the computer market was not going to pay for style or miniaturization, and that's all the Cube offered for the extra money. Apple sales in general were soft in the second half of 2000, despite all the new product introductions, leading to Apple's first quarterly loss since Steve Jobs took over. And not a slight loss, about $250 million. Although, to be fair, the whole industry was being dragged down at that time by the dot-com crash. In the end, when asked about the Cube's failure, Steve said, "That was not a failure of design, it was a failure of concept. We targeted the Cube at a professional audience. We thought they would rather have something small on the desk than expandability, and we were wrong. It was a wrong concept, fabulously implemented." That kind of sums it up. I didn't really need to do this video. Thanks to local vintage computer expert Derek for supplying the eMac shown in this video. Also thanks to YouTube's The Newful for donating the 12-inch PCI card. Maybe I'll look inside the Cube in a future video, but this is all I have time for, apparently. If you have interesting memories about the Cube, please leave a comment. Alright, I'm done. Go!